This is a recording of the International Communist Party, which maintains its direct line running from Marx to Lenin to the foundation of the Third International and the birth of the Communist Party of Italy in Leghorn, Livorno, in 1921, and from there to the struggle of the Italian communist left against the degeneration in Moscow and to the rejection of popular fronts and coalitions of resistance groups. Today, we will be reading from our index, On Organic Centralism, Part 1 of Lenin, the Organic Centralist from 2021. Part 1. Historical Invariance of the Communist Party. This work aims to demonstrate what we have affirmed since the birth of the party. Alongside the claim of a doctrine that has remained unique and intangible since the enunciation of its theoretical foundations with the Manifesto of the Communist Party of 1848, we claim that just as the doctrine has been transmitted intact to this day, the way of conceiving the party of the Communist Revolution is also that of our teachers. Already, Marx and Engels, throughout their lives, had harshly and disdainfully condemned, both in the party's embryonic and undeveloped forms at first, and then in the developed ones, any improper attitudes with respect to its nature, its tasks, and the aims of communism. Well known are their surprise and disgust at certain attitudes of some anarchists, for example, and in their hard work they never descended to unworthy methods of political struggle, contrary to the conviction and help to the collective maturation of the world movement. We anticipate here a central thesis. The Communist Party wages a political struggle, but externally against its many enemies, not internally, except in the event of irreparable degeneration. Within the party there are no polemics and no propaganda among comrades. Lenin was eventually able to design and build a party that lived up to the task that awaited it, not only, as is evident from the point of view of theory, but also from that of its organizational structure and organic functioning, aspects nevertheless never addressed separately. The belief that Lenin's party was, in the substance of the guidelines and of the way of conceiving the work, the same as that of the left, before and after the Second World War, taking into account the obvious differences of time and place, has always been a deep-rooted belief in the party, and an obvious consequence of doctrinaire homogeneity. A belief that is confirmed by a letter circulated internally over 50 years ago, written by the party center at the time. Our enemies have always wanted to oppose Lenin to the tradition of the left, not only in the field of organizational matters, but in all fields. Our efforts, however, has always been to discover the permanent Lenin under the contingent of Lenin, to show how the new type party that he was able to create in antithesis to the social democracy of the Second International already represents the party as we conceive it, and how a truly organic method already emerged behind the formula of democratic centralism, which is to be seen not in the individual solutions given by Lenin to individual contingent problems, but in the continuity of his action. We must therefore deal with this issue by giving greater importance to the historical method, and bearing in mind how the transition from the second phase of the maturation of the class party in relation to the development of capitalism to the third phase, which is both that of imperialism and of our party. Linked to this defect of ahistoricity, there is that of considering the organizational problems as standalone. Instead, it must be demonstrated how the centralism of the Bolshevik Party was achieved through a struggle for the program, principles and tactics of communism, before and after the Second Congress of 1903. Letter from the Center to the Restricted Network, 24/3/1967. Our party therefore claims total continuity with the purest revolutionary tradition of the working class, starting from the Manifesto of the Communist Party of 1848, passing through the most orthodox, in the Marxist sense, expression of the three internationals as to theory and action, and proclaims itself to be the direct heir of the Communist Party of Italy, founded in 1921, and with which it also boosts an uninterrupted physical continuity as concerns organization and men, champions for over a century of the uncorrupted tradition of revolutionary left communism. Part 2. Reasserted confirmations from a great past. While never losing contact with the working class and its daily struggle, it is our tradition to devote a lot of energy, in times when conditions are not favorable to direct revolutionary attack, to the study of the theoretical basis of our way of existing and working, both to reappropriate these continuously and to preserve with the work of sculpting our positions in doctrine and tactics, which does not mean enrichment, updating, or worse, revision, but rather the highlighting of increasingly clear and detailed confirmations of the correctness of our way of interpreting the revolutionary process. It is our firm belief that the doctrine of the revolution is not built by subsequent contributions and additions, in a process that would never be considered finished, and therefore susceptible to continuous improvements and updates in the light of alleged new conditions previously unpredictable. The doctrine of the revolution, which is formed on the basis of historical, economic, scientific, philosophical data, and also following utopian theorizations of future society, was born in a single block in the first half of the 19th century, and sees the light in the form of the Communist Manifesto. Nothing new has been added in the more than 170 years following this theoretical body that contradicts its assumptions, if not continuous sculptures made by true Marxists, which make the instrument of theory more and more manageable and effective. The party, therefore, to the shame of the hesitant and the doubtful, is always ready to play its role, with all the tools it needs, none excluded, to be applied to the disruptive and invincible force of the proletariat. Consequently, the party is at the same time the custodian of the doctrine and the organ which, according to it, will have to carry out a leading role for the revolutionary class. It is therefore important for us to pay particular attention to this organ of the working class, even when the class, in the vast majority of its components, ignores it, as in the present moment. The formation of the Bolshevik Party. The International Communist Party is not only the heir of the Italian left, it is our firm belief that there are no substantial differences between our way of understanding the party and that of Lenin. Obviously, after having appropriately assessed the historical and environmental differences between the situations in which the two organizations have found themselves operating. This work intends to read the experience of Lenin and his party, underlining the characteristics that are of general value, the same characteristics of our small movement today. To understand what the Revolutionary Party meant to Lenin, and to interpret his position correctly, it is essential to have a clear understanding of the exact context in which Lenin operated, especially in the period defining what the Bolshevik Party would be before and after the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, or RSDLP. A brief historical preamble is therefore necessary to allow us to define the characteristics of the various political actors, movements, and ideologies that circulated in Russia at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. Lenin gives us a description of the origins of the party in Russia both in the conclusion of What is to be Done and in the preface of the 12 Years collection, written in 1907. It was in the 1880s that Marxism penetrated Russia, where the populist movement had developed. The emancipation of labor group was established abroad around Marxist theory and with correct propositions on the tactics of the proletariat in the double revolution. In What is to be Done, Lenin claims that the group possessed not only theory, but had also developed a tactical plan for the perspective of the Russian Revolution and the function of the proletariat in it. In the first period, 1880 to 1898, the Marxist struggle was directed above all against populism, a political movement that developed in Russia between the last quarter of the 19th century and the early 20th century. Its aim was to achieve, through the propaganda and proselytism carried out by intellectuals among the people and with terrorist direct action, an improvement of the living conditions of the lower classes, in particular of the peasants and serfs, and the realization of a kind of rural socialism based on the Russian village community, the mir, in contrast to Western individual society. To confront this doctrine, it was not only authentic Marxists who intervened, but also a whole series of actors for whom the criticism of populism meant the need for a passage to bourgeois democracy. This was the era of legal Marxism. The struggle was therefore waged on two fronts, against populism and against petty bourgeois Marxism, and the first socialist writings are dedicated to this struggle, mainly by Lenin and Plekhnakov. In the year 1890, Lenin's debut in the political arena simply coincides with this, the appearance of the working class in Russia. In this era, Russian Marxists were reduced to a small group, what Lenin writes in What is to be Done. It is important. This group of intellectuals had already worked out everything. They did not wait for the masses. The first notable workers' unrest occurred in 1896, and the group of intellectuals threw themselves into the struggle, indicating to the movement not only its immediate tasks, but its entire perspective up to socialism. The effects of this and subsequent movements were as follows. 1. The established ties to the working class masses. 2. The party segregated itself clearly from legal Marxism. 3. The party organization was formed. 1898. Lenin states in all of his works, including What is to be Done, that from 1896 onward the Russian proletariat was never static. The situation was that the party organization was inadequate to guide the lively movement of the working masses. So the crucial question is posed in what is to be done precisely. What must a party fit for the purpose of leading the workers' movement be? It was in the face of this exuberant workers' movement that the economist deviation manifested itself. This is a first characteristic trait that must be noted if we truly believe that the party is a product and a factor of class struggle. The difficulties regarding the formation of a revolutionary party must be seen in the particular situation of Russia compared to other industrialized countries or on the way to industrialization. The workers were very few in percentage and concentrated in some industrial districts. The rest of the vast country was a large countryside with small and medium-sized farmers, in addition to large estates with wage laborers or former serfs, from whose ranks came the generation which, at the turn of the century, constituted the industrial proletariat. Trade union tradition was almost non-existent, as was socialist propaganda. The revolutionaries, therefore, had to speak to a predominantly illiterate and suspicious audience. This was a situation, however, that could reveal positive aspects. Indeed, not even the opportunistic poison had penetrated that much into the class, and it was easier to confront proletarians with the reality of their conditions and to help them to draw valuable indications from the struggles as to who were their friends and who their enemies. On the other hand, the bourgeois-oriented opportunism of a bourgeoisie that had to be revolutionary towards absolutism did not have the weapons typical of opportunism or had little of it: propaganda, traditions, electoralism. It was therefore at first an opportunism little equipped with theoretical tools, although rapidly evolving, even within the socialist movement, and also thanks to the development of opportunism in Western Europe in those years. The second characteristic that must be taken into account: since 1894 through 1895, the Russian working class never lost contact with its party. Its size can be deduced from Lenin's data on members. Between 1894 and 1895, several hundred workers. In 1906, around 33,000 members attend the Stockholm Congress. In 1907, 150,000 to 170,000 members, and then in 1913, 33,000 members to 50,000 members. Lenin provided these figures in 1913, while arguing with Reasserted, who claimed that Russian social democracy was composed of intellectual currents. It is natural that the situation needs to be taken into account when dealing with organizational problems. It was Lenin himself who categorically stated this in the preface to the aforementioned 12 Years collection. Part 4. Against Localism for Communist Centralization. The 1898 Congress created an underground organization and tried to start publishing an illegal newspaper, but the central leadership was almost immediately broken up by the police, and the work could not continue. The organization was reduced to clubs, local groups without any structured link among them and without any continuity of work. Lenin rejected the argument, which still found a broad appreciation among Russian socialists, according to which the greatest need would have been to develop the network of local circles and to multiply and strengthen the local press. For Lenin, the most urgent issue for the movement no longer consisted in the development of the old local and uncoordinated work. It was that of uniting, of organization. This is a step for which a program is a necessity. The program must formulate our basic views, precisely establish our immediate political tasks, point out the immediate demands that must show the area of agitational activity, give unity to the agitational work, expand and deepen it, thus raising it from fragmentary partial agitation for petty isolated demands to the status of agitation for the sum total of social democratic demands. Lenin, collected works in 45 volumes, Lawrence and Wishart, London, 4/230. In the rest of the text, the mere mention of a volume and pages will refer to this collection. Part 5. The revolution is not a matter of forms of organization. Even if, as we shall see, the organizational question was the main task of the movement, however, a vulgar fable must be debunked: that the particular form given to the Bolshevik Party, apart from its doctrine and program, has made it an instrument capable in itself, with its discipline, of stirring up a revolution. This does not detract from the importance of how the party organizes itself, and the history of the Bolshevik Party in the specific situation of Russia shows this. Through questions of organization, all forms of opportunism repeatedly try to penetrate into the party. hence the party's tireless struggle for an organization well connected to the theoretical foundations of Marxism. A period of dispersion and confusion started, which Lenin described both in What is to be Done and in the aforementioned preface. The characteristics of this period, between 1898 and 1903, are the following. 1. The workers are on the move. 2. Intellectual youth increasingly passes to Marxism and becomes infatuated with the workers' movement. 3. Any centralized organization, any continuous and unitary work is missing. 4. The workers' movement, legal Marxist literature and revisionism takes hold on young revolutionaries. It is the era of clubs. This is how Lenin describes it. 5. Terrorist and anarchist tendencies are revived as a reaction. Abroad, the organization of the RSDLP existed as the Union of Russian Social Democrats, of which Plekhanov's Emancipation of Labor Group was a part. The publication of a Central Party organ, the Rabochaya Gazeta, was attempted. Lenin wrote a few articles for it, but it was never published. In Russia, there were only local newspapers and other publications. Part 6. Against Economism, Economic Struggle and Political Struggle. Economism was born, that is, the tendency to overestimate the importance of the spontaneous economic struggle of the proletariat, and to underestimate its political tasks. Who were the economists, and what was their program, as summarized in the Credo of 1899, but already presented in an article of Rabochaya Misl of October 1897? In the latter writing, the economists, who we would rightly call today, with very few differences, workerists, state that the economic struggle is the way towards further victories. Let the workers fight for themselves and not for future generations. Workers for workers. The party, the perspectives of the revolution, not to mention Marxism and revolutionary theory, are not mentioned. The consequence of economism is the theoretical justification and the system of local circles. Bernsteinism is closely linked to economism, which also devalues the tasks of the proletariat in the bourgeois revolution and supports the need for a criticism of Marxist theory in the reformist sense. Economism permeates many Russian circles, creating an anti-party, anti-organization, anti-theory, etc. mentality. Lenin immediately opposed it with a meeting of 17 militants deported to Siberia, who spoke out for the condemnation of those positions. Lenin demolished them in the A Protest by Russian Social Democrats, written in 1899 on behalf of the exiled social democratic community in Siberia. It is not true to say that the working class in the West did not take part in the struggle for political liberty and in political revolutions. The history of the Chartist movement and the revolutions of 1848 in France, Germany, and Austria prove the opposite. It is absolutely untrue to say that Marxism was the theoretical expression of the prevailing practice, of the political struggle predominating over the economic. On the contrary, Marxism appeared at a time when non-political socialism prevailed, Owenism, Fourierism, true socialism, and the Communist Manifesto took up the cudgels at once against non-political socialism. Even when Marxism came out fully armed with theory, capital, and organized the celebrated International Working Men's Association, the political struggle was by no means the prevailing practice. Narrow trade unionism in England, anarchism and Proudhonism in the Romance countries. In Germany, the great historic service performed by Lassalle was the transformation of the working class from an appendage of the liberal bourgeoisie into an independent political party. Marxism linked up the economic and political struggle of the working class into a single, inseparable whole, and the effort of the authors of the Credo to separate these forms of struggle is one of their most clumsy and deplorable departures from Marxism. Similarly, there can be no suggestion of a radical change in the practical activity of the West European workers' parties, in spite of what the authors of the Credo say. The tremendous importance of the economic struggle of the proletariat, and the necessity for such struggle, were recognized by Marxism from the very outset. As early as the 40s, Marx and Engels conducted a polemic against the utopian socialists who denied the importance of this struggle. 4, 175 to 176. Part 7. Against Free Criticism. In 1900, the Social Democratic Organization abroad split, a part of which passed over to economism and freedom of criticism. The Union of Russian Social Democrats Abroad published the Rabochaya Delo, which was imbued with economism and Bernsteinianism, but tried to conceal it. It was for the reconstitution of the party's organizational unity on the theoretical basis of freedom of criticism and on the practical basis of broad democracy in the organization. Plekhanov broke away from the Union and founded the organization Social Democrat. The need for organizational unification was clearly felt, because all the work in Russia was falling apart, ruined by localism, by approximation, by artisanal and generic methods. Iskra and its circle took to the field on the problem of the reconstitution of the party at the end of 1900. Among the Social Democrats, there were the following positions. 1. The real economists, who did not even feel the need for the organization and devalued its importance. They were the theorizers of what exists in the present movement. 2. The tendency of rabochayodelo, a shapeless trend that defended the legitimacy of revisionism and freedom of criticism on a theoretical level, a purely organizational unification guaranteed by internal democracy on a practical level. 3. Iskra, which wanted to base the organization on the net clarification of theoretical, programmatic, and tactical positions, and wanted to break with economism. Iskra intended to reassert Marxist orthodoxy and make the periodical the ideological headquarters that acted as a link among all revolutionary Marxists. In its first issue of December 1900, its constant concern was disclosed: to infuse the proletarian masses with social democratic ideas and consciousness, organize a strong and disciplined party of full-time revolutionaries, and through them create solid links with the spontaneous workers' movement. This is to prevent workers from slipping into reformism and the intelligentsia from remaining at a superficial level of mere doctrinaire disputes. In June 1901, representatives of the organizations in exile met in Geneva. The unity achieved at that conference proved to be short-lived, and Iskra consequently stiffened and became increasingly skeptical about the possibilities of achieving unification. In October of the same year, a new conference was held in Zurich which, after lively discussion, ended with a complete breakdown by the left. Immediately after Iskra, militants from the Social Democrat group and others joined together in a new organization, the League of Russian Revolutionary Social Democracy. In their programmatic declaration, they declared themselves proud to be called sectarians. Part 8. What is to be done? A milestone of Marxism. The most complete expression of the Iskra campaign is What is to be done, in which Lenin poses all questions from a coherently Marxist point of view. A. Theory, its importance and its invariance. B. Function of the proletariat in the double revolution, the necessity of the autonomous party and of the proletarian political struggle. C. Relations between party and class, between trade unionist politics and social democratic politics, between spontaneity and consciousness. Finally, an organizational plan. The following are needed. 1. A single political newspaper for all Russia. 2. A clandestine organization of professional revolutionaries closely anchored to principles, well delimited from the outside, uninterrupted over time and connected in space, surrounded by a whole series of legal and semi-legal organizations specialized in practical work and strictly centralized, and 3. A planned tactic, descending from the principles and that does not change overnight. As concerns theory, Lenin is categorical, and he did not hesitate to call upon Engels to testify, by amply quoting him, to demonstrate how the German workers themselves, at that very moment in the vanguard in Europe, had taken advantage of the theoretical conquests of the struggles and of the consequent theoretical elaborations that took place in France and England in the field of political and economic struggle. The problem was represented by the defenders of the freedom of criticism, which Lenin defined as freedom for an opportunist trend in social democracy, freedom to convert social democracy into a democratic party of reform, freedom to introduce bourgeois ideas and bourgeois elements into socialism. What is to be done is a text of ours in all respects. Iskra's organizational plan can be shared word for word. We note that Lenin raises the question of the rigid delimitation of the organization of revolutionaries from other organizations, including workers. He also raises the question of maximum specialization in the field of practical action, but not in the work of theoretical study. We also note that Lenin raises the question of instruments, the operational means that are all really able to organize and are not mere organizational or hierarchical formulas. Communal work for a communal newspaper, party organizations that are accustomed by the work itself to react simultaneously to events up to the insurrection. The newspaper as a collective organizer. The same themes are taken up again in the A Letter to a Comrade on Our Organizational Tasks immediately following What is to be Done. It would perhaps be possible to get along without rules. We are already at organic centralism. Part 9. From Circles to Party. The Second Congress met in August 1903, which had to proceed with the reunification of the party on the basis of Iskra's propositions. Everyone now accepted the Iskrist program, but Lenin noted and showed that acceptance of a program in words is not enough if the organizational discipline of the party is not accepted. This statement is not mechanical, but rather historical and dialectical in meaning, even if it is perfectly acceptable to us in the simple and the literal sense. Think about it. There was economism until yesterday. There were circles until yesterday with their own vision, their own structure, their own tradition. There was and still is Bernsteinism. Iskra had hammered its propositions for 3 years, and the situation of the material struggle had slowly forced all militants either to take sides openly with Iskra or to admit the plan of Iskra as the only valid one. Lenin did not mean the same thing as others with the word unification. The meaning he gave it was this: unity of the presently autonomous local circles of the Marxist movement in a party controlled by the center and ideologically homogeneous for all Russia. Unique disciplines and ideological homogeneity, that was unification. To reach it, he was ready to reject compromises and let go all those who would not have accepted a centralized organization. All newspapers unwilling to merge into one national body, the Jewish Socialist Bund if it had not been ready to give up its autonomy, the revisionists and the economists, and all those who were not ready to accept without discussion the orthodox Marxist program, which he, Plekhanov, and the other editors of Iskra would have prepared for the next Congress. There were some who thought that the first requirement of the unborn party was a prolonged, full, and free discussion of fundamental principles. But for Lenin, as for Plekhanov, all this had already been solved in Western Europe by the works of Marx and Engels, and again by those of Kautsky and Plekhanov in their still heated controversy with Bernstein. The Congress was therefore convened, in view of the acceptance of the Iskrit plan. Well, gentlemen, words are not enough, facts are needed. And we Iskrits put facts forth to you that show whether your acceptance is real or just words. To you who until yesterday were defending the legitimacy of what exists, let us put this touchstone. All circles must be dissolved, and all newspapers suppressed. There are no imperative mandates to the Congress. Part 10. The crucial paragraph 1. And the test bears fruit. To you who until yesterday defended the organizations for the economic struggle and the party as the ideal superior instance, we propose a first paragraph of the statute that sounds like this. A member of the party is not only the one who accepts the program and supports it to the extent of his forces, but he who also works in one of the party organizations. Are you really for the distinction between party and class? Prove it by accepting these conditions. The discussion on paragraph 1 is important because it raises the wider question of party organization. Says Lenin, the definition given in my draft was, a member of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party is one who accepts its program and who supports the party both financially and by personal participation in one of the party organizations. In place of the words I have underlined, Martov proposed, work under the control and direction of one of the party organizations. My formulation was supported by Plekhanov, Martov's by the rest of the editorial board. Axelrod was their spokesman at the Congress. We argued that the concept party member must be narrowed so as to separate those who worked from those who merely talked, to eliminate organizational chaos, to eliminate the monstrous and absurd possibility of there being organizations which consisted of party members, but which were not party organizations, and so on. Martov stood for broadening the party and spoke of a broad class movement needing a broad, i.e. diffuse, organization, and so forth. It is amusing to note that in defense of their views, nearly all Martov's supporters cited what is to be done. Plekhanov hotly opposed Martov, pointing out that his Jurist formulation would fling open the doors to the opportunists, who just longed for such a position of being inside the party, but outside its organization. Under the control and direction, I said, would in practice mean nothing more nor less than without any control or direction. Martov hoped for a mass party, but in doing so he opened the doors to all sorts of opportunists, made the party's limits indeterminate and vague. And this was a serious danger, as it was not easy to distinguish the boundary between the revolutionary and the idle chatterbox. Lenin says that a good third of the participants at the Congress were schemers. Why worry about those who don't want to or cannot join the party organizations, Plekhanov wondered. Workers wishing to join the party will not be afraid to join one of its organizations. Discipline doesn't scare them. Intellectuals, completely imbued with bourgeois individualism, will fear entering. These bourgeois individualists are generally the representatives of all sorts of opportunism. We have to get them away from us. The project is a shield against their breaking into the party, and only for this reason should all enemies of opportunism vote for Lenin's proposal. Proceedings of the Second Congress, session of August 2nd, number 15. The minutes are from the website Marxists.org. Trotsky spoke against Lenin's proposal, considering it ineffective. Lenin replied to him, Trotsky has failed to notice a basic question. Does my formulation narrow or expand the concept of a party member? If he had asked himself that question, he would easily have seen that my formulation narrows this concept, while Martov expands it. Or, to use Martov's own correct expression, what distinguishes his concept is its elasticity. And in the period of party life that we are now passing through, it is just this elasticity that undoubtedly opens the door to all elements of confusion, vacillation, and opportunism. Part 11. Organizational steadfastness, tactical coherence, purity of principles. And the unstable elements are harbingers of uncertainties, deviations, and little work. The danger can be great. The need to safeguard the firmness of the party line and the purity of its principles has now become particularly urgent, for, with the restoration of its unity, the party will recruit into its ranks a great many unstable elements whose numbers will increase with the growth of the party. On the other hand, where is the danger of a rigorous delimitation of the party through specific limits to the definition of social democrat? If hundreds and thousands of workers who were arrested for taking part in strikes and demonstrations did not prove to be members of party organizations, it would only show that we have good organizations, and that we are fulfilling our task of keeping a more or less limited circle of leaders secret and of drawing the broadest possible masses into the movement. But the party, a vanguard component of the working class, cannot be confused with the whole class, as Axelrod did. It would be better if 10 who do work should not call themselves party members — real workers don't hunt after titles — than that one who only talks should have the right and opportunity to be a party member. The Central Committee will never be able to exercise real control over all who do the work but do not belong to organizations. It is our task to place actual control in the hands of the Central Committee. It is our task to safeguard the firmness, consistency, and purity of our party. We must strive to raise the title and the significance of a party member higher, higher, and still higher. Part 12. Professional Revolutionaries. Apparently, Lenin seemed to distinguish between simple party militants and professional revolutionaries, whose small groups formed the backbone of the leadership. We have repeatedly shown that this was the illegal network, not the overlapping of a bureaucratic apparatus of people on the party. Professional does not necessarily mean salaried, but rather dedicated to the struggle of the party for voluntary choice, separated from any association for the defense of collective interests, even if this remains the deterministic basis for the very existence of the party. The whole range of Marxist dialectics is in this double relationship. The worker is revolutionary for class interest, the communist is revolutionary for the same purpose, but elevated beyond the subjective interest. Russia and Revolution in Marxist Theory, 1955, Part 2, and 37. The right wing of the Russian party wanted to recruit the party members from professional or factory groups of workers federated in the party. The trade unions were called professional associations by the Russians. For polemical reasons, Lenin expresses the famous sentence that the party is above all an organization of professional revolutionaries. We don't ask them, are you a wage worker? In which profession? Mechanic, boiler maker, carpenter? They can be factory workers as well as students or even sons of noblemen. Their answer will be revolutionary. This is my profession. Only Stalinist stupidity could give to such sentence the meaning of revolutionary by trade, of one salaried by the party. Such useless formula. should the functionaries be found among the workers or elsewhere, would not have made any progress because it was about something completely different. The Croaking About Praxis, Second Programma Comunista, 1953. Part 13. Knowledge and Militancy, Proletarian Consciousness. So for the Bolsheviks, the revolutionary militant is he who accepts and does not necessarily know or understand in detail the program and is willing to work under the orders of the party. Abnegation qualities, willingness to fight, that any proletarian can have even if illiterate. An acceptance of this program that can be based on the understanding of a few qualifying aspects, sometimes only of slogans, but which coincide with his deep aspirations, with his needs. An adhesion based more on passion than on intellect. Understanding will come over time, but will never be complete. On the other hand, total understanding of the doctrine can never be of the individual, but of the collective of the party, and is expressed in its press, in its thesis, in its revolutionary tactics. Doctrinal knowledge is not an individual fact, even by the most cultured follower or leader. Nor is it a condition for the mass in motion. It has as its subject its own organ, the party. Russia and Revolution, Part 32. This concept is repeated in the thesis of 1952. The question of individual consciousness is not the basis of the formation of the party. Not only can't each proletarian be conscious, and least of all culturally master the class doctrine, but not even an individual militant, and this guarantee is not even given by the leaders. It only exists in the organic unity of the party. Characteristic Thesis of the Party, 1952. Beyond the influence of social democracy, there is no other conscious activity of the workers, says Lenin at the Second Congress, and we add, it is heavy, but it is so. So the action of the proletarians is spontaneous in that it arises from economic determinants, but does not have a consciousness as a condition, neither in the individual nor in the class. The physical class struggle is a spontaneous deed, unconscious. The class reaches consciousness only when the revolutionary party has formed within it, which possesses the theoretical consciousness based on the real class relationship, characteristic of all proletarians. These, however, will never be able to possess its true knowledge, that is, theory, neither as individuals, nor as a whole, nor as a majority, as long as the proletariat is subject to bourgeois education and culture, that is, to the bourgeois fabrication of its ideology, and, in clear terms, until the proletariat wins and ceases to exist. So, in exact terms, proletarian consciousness will never be. There is doctrine, communist knowledge, and this is in the party of the proletariat, not in the class. Part 14. Autonomy, Democracy, and Free Criticism. Bolsheviks and Mensheviks formed two organized factions from 1903 to 1906. The Congress was to be an arena of struggle, and it really was. As the Bolsheviks set their conditions, there were opposing positions. And where necessarily? On the organizational question. All those who had previously been opponents of Iskra theoretically, programmatically, and tactically now shouted against centralism and discipline. Were for the autonomy and democracy of the organization, they accused the revolutionary wing of bureaucratism, of imposing a state of siege. But all of Lenin's bureaucratism was to impose a state of siege on opportunist positions. All the alleged maneuverism of Lenin, who, on the contrary, never abandoned sincere and fraternal, non-political behaviors towards all comrades, including opponents. He had been the champion of the involvement of the party in economic struggles of the working class in the 1895 through 1897 years. Still, he had to destroy the economists' position in the years preceding the Second Congress. Now was the moment to defend bureaucratism, understood as the denial of the craving for freedom of criticism, of autonomy within the party. Centralism as a primary necessity. This was not understood then by Trotsky and Luxemburg. Lenin is accused by the opposers, particularly Martov, to be guilty of formalism and bureaucratism. Therefore, Lenin is forced to defend the democratic mechanism adopted at the Congress, while Martov defends democracy from below. Bureaucracy versus democracy is in fact centralism versus autonomism. It is the organizational principle of revolutionary social democracy as opposed to the organizational principle of opportunist social democracy. The latter strives to proceed from the bottom upward, and therefore, wherever possible and as far as possible upholds autonomism and democracy, carried by the overzealous to the point of anarchism. The former strives to proceed from the top downward, and upholds an extension of the rights and powers of the center in relation to the parts. Lenin must get back to the issue of one. Did my formulation, which was supported by Plekhanov, reflect a wrong, bureaucratic, formalistic, jack-in-offense, unsocial democratic conception of centralism, opportunism and anarchism, or bureaucracy and formalism? That is the way the question stands now, when the little difference has become a big one. If the talk about democracy contains any principle at all, if it is not just an anarchist denial of the duty of the part to submit to the whole, then what we have here is the principle of opportunism, which seeks to lessen the responsibility of individual intellectuals to the party of the proletariat, to lessen the influence of the central institutions, to enlarge the autonomy of the least steadfast elements in the party, to reduce organizational relationships to a purely platonic and verbal acceptance of them. What is the lesson we can draw from this experience of the Bolsheviks? It is Lenin himself who instructs us. It is highly interesting to note that these fundamental characteristics of opportunism in matters of organization, autonomism, aristocratic or intellectualist anarchism, tailism, and Girondism, are mutatis mutandis, with appropriate modifications, to be observed in all the social democratic parties in the world, wherever there is a division into a revolutionary and an opportunist wing, and where is there not. Not only in Germany, but in France and Italy as well, the opportunists are all staunch supporters of autonomism, of a slackening of party discipline, of reducing it to naught. Everywhere their tendencies lead to disorganization and to perverting the democratic principles into anarchism. Opportunism in matters of organization is the deviation that Lenin himself denounces several times in his writings. The undoubted tendency to defend autonomism against centralism, which is a fundamental characteristic of opportunism in matters of organization. Opportunism in program is naturally connected with opportunism in tactics and opportunism in organization. Democratism is often invoked to support opportunism. We have rejected democratic mechanisms, but democratism can appear in many disguised ways. Any breach in the organic way of working is a door open to opportunism, which usually starts with deviation on organizational matters. Hence our maniacal attention to the correct way to work and relate among comrades. Therefore, the bureaucratism that Lenin defends in 1903 to 1904 is nothing but centralism and adherence to the correct Marxist principles, together with the need of a strong, efficient organization. In other places, Lenin of course denounces bureaucratism. Bureaucracy means subordinating the interests of the work to the interests of one's own career. It means focusing attention on places and ignoring the work itself. It means wrangling over co-optation instead of fighting for ideas. That bureaucracy of this kind is undesirable and detrimental to the party is unquestionably true. The same will the left do in the 1950s, speaking of the functioning of the Stalinist parties, which went as far as exterminating the old guard of the party leadership of the October Revolution, and which transformed the communist parties in servants of the Russian state and persecutors of true revolutionaries, with violence as well with barefaced falsification. Although party doctrine is always the same, in given moments and situations the party may insist on certain issues more than others. All this Lenin narrates in 1904 in One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, where he notes the division in two wings of social democracy as a positive fact. The division of the party in two warring wings, Lenin notes, was characteristic of all the parties of the Second International. The division has roots in the social situation of the proletariat. The same was confirmed after the Fourth Congress of 1906. The opportunist current, legal Marxism, economism, Menshevism, represented the influence of the petty bourgeois on the proletariat. Here's how Lenin poses the question. In all capitalist countries, the proletariat is inevitably connected by 1,000 transitional links with its neighbors on the right, the petty bourgeoisie. In all workers' parties, there inevitably emerges a more or less clearly delineated right wing which, in its views, tactics, and organizational line, reflects the opportunist tendencies of the petty bourgeoisie. The attitude the Bolsheviks held prior to 1917 of tolerating within the party spurious or uncertain currents varies depending on the possibility to wait for the latter's maturing in a radical Marxist direction in light of the movement's experience. Otherwise, a clear and intransient differentiation and separation was mandatory when a lack of clarity and uncertainty in tactics would be disastrous for the fate of the revolution. Legitimate choices in a country with a weak, immature proletariat like Russia at the time. Lenin would be much more decisive after the outbreak of the World War as well as after the founding of the Third International, although for us insufficiently applied to the parties of the West. Part 15. The unavoidable executive discipline. After the Congress, a part of the Iskra group which gathered together all the discontents refused to disband and sabotaged the normal performance of all party work. The last part of Lenin's pamphlet and the epithet of Anarchy of Great Lords is dedicated to this attitude, which did not recognize the decisions of the Congress and the submission of the minority to the majority. The formal rules that still governed the confrontation of opinions within the party envisaged, according to democratic centralism, the submission of the minority, which was however guaranteed the possibility of freely expressing and arguing its opinions before the whole party. This discussion between comrades from the same party was governed by precise forms and customs, always careful to avoid lacerations and damage to the organization. The party is the general staff of an army at war and under enemy fire. Its unity of action and executive discipline cannot be broken. That ideal struggle, the word is Lenin's, between a majority and a minority in democratic forms had a role in the life of the party, of course, so long as, due to historical immaturity, the confrontation between opposite approaches and conceptions was inevitable. However, this must never break the unity of action, the executive discipline. For Lenin, and for us, belonging to the party means to work with and for the party. This very fact of refusing to work together is nothing but a split. The ideal struggle in the RSDLP remained until 1906, with several attempts by the Bolsheviks to bring the Mensheviks back to work. Of course, practical work in Russia was greatly affected by this situation and fell almost entirely to the Bolsheviks. In May 1905, on the initiative of the Bolshevik committees, the Third Congress was held in London, in which the tactics for the next revolution were defined. The Mensheviks simultaneously convened a conference in Geneva, where they adopted completely opposite tactical resolutions. In Two Tactics of Social Democracy, written in July 1905, Lenin still proposes the unification of tactics as the best for the future unification of the party. The thesis is still that the revolution instructs. That is, it is still possible that the Mensheviks, as a current having a basis in the workers' movement, abandon their propositions driven by the facts. The pamphlet is clearly designed with this purpose in mind. From October to December 1905, there were great revolutionary events. Under the pressure of these and their effective working-class base, the Mensheviks supported the proletariat even if in an uncertain and hesitant manner. The possibility of an organizational reunification arises. The two factions went to the Fourth Congress in April 1906. The Congress was in the majority for the Mensheviks. Lenin set out the conditions of unification, but it is significant that he reaffirmed the importance of theory. In view of the coming formidable, decisive events in the people's struggle, it is all the more essential to attain the practical unity of the class-conscious proletariat of the whole of Russia and of all her nationalities. In a revolutionary epoch like the present, all theoretical errors and tactical deviations of the party are most ruthlessly criticized by experience itself, which enlightens and educates the working class with unprecedented rapidity. At such time, the duty of every social democrat is to strive to ensure that the ideological structure within the party on questions of theory and tactics is conducted as openly, widely, and freely as possible, but that on no accounts does it disturb or hamper the unity of the revolutionary action of the social democratic proletariat. This is important because it poses the question of discipline in the situation in which the revolutionary wing is in the majority, although defending the clearest and unambiguous distinction between the two wings and allowing ample space for freedom of internal criticism, etc. The Central Committee's resolution is essentially wrong and runs counter to the party rules. The principle of democratic centralism and autonomy for local party organizations implies universal and full freedom to criticize, so long as this does not disturb the unity of a definite action. It rules out all criticism which disrupts or makes difficult the unity of an action decided on by the party. At the same Congress, an a posteriori theoretical victory of Lenin took place. The famous paragraph 1, which in the Second Congress had been included in the party program of the Bolshevik formulation, was adopted in Lenin's wording. In this period, the first part of 1906, the Bolsheviks were for the boycott of the Duma. A theoretical boycott, though, because Witt's Duma was never convened and a period of reaction followed. The Mensheviks instead proposed support for a cadet minister. Lenin then appealed to the right of party organizations and party proletarians to discuss Central Committee decisions, especially if they contradicted Congress resolutions. In short, in today's language, the center has no right to act or even theorize in contradiction with the party's program. Part 16. The alleged Leninist creativity. Lenin's What is to be Done is, as we all know, a fundamental text for us left-wing revolutionary Marxists, who are heirs of the communist left, but nevertheless not separated from Lenin's Marxism. We acknowledge his theoretical work in full, for it is grounded on the same foundations on which the left had grown, and the left had achieved the same theoretical conclusions even before getting to know Lenin's works, which, for the most part, would only reach Italy several years after their publication in Russia. The first edition of What is to be Done in Italian is from 1946, although the text was already known in the first post-war period by the Italian communists in other languages. There remains the obligation to demonstrate the continuity of positions, often up to an identity in the formulations between us and the Bolsheviks, to shut down those who, imagining a theoretical creativity in Lenin, make his doctrine something new in the Marxist panorama, to be associated with the many others that have plagued the revolutionary movement of the proletariat over the decades. The legend of innovations, of tactical and theoretical inventions, of shrewd maneuverings by Lenin is one that does not stand up to an honest reading of his writings, which we will try to do here, at least in relation to a key period of the formulation of the RSDLP, Russian Socialist Democratic Labor Party, the period around the Second Party Congress, from 1901 to 1904. The falsification of Lenin's thought, which is nothing more than the consistent Marxism, always better defined and, as we say, sculpted, is a work that has allowed hordes of intellectuals orbiting the areas more or less on the left of the workers' movement, from declared bourgeois liberals to anarchists and Stalinists, to earn a definitely deserved salary, given the damage caused to the same movement. In Italy, the most important sphere for this purpose of the left was, as long as it existed, that of the Italian Communist Party, to which many historians, philosophers, sociologists, etc. made reference. These, for over 50 years, gave of their best to refute Marxism by pretending to exalt it. The technique is always the same. We start by recognizing the historical significance of given theses and positions, then to insert almost in passing a poisonous word that effectively nullifies their revolutionary force. It is the technique of Stalinism, which not by chance coined the disgraceful term of Leninism. It was not yet opportune to speak ill of Lenin outright, so the difficult job required a skilled craftsman, a good intellectual. For Lenin, as for us, the theory of revolution was born in a single block from the Manifesto of 1848 and is then defined, clarified, deepened in the subsequent writings of Marx and Engels, and also in those of Lenin, never in contradiction with those of the two great maestros. On the contrary, by citing them often, whenever he had to defend assumptions that were hard to accept by the less well-equipped comrades. The process of elaboration that takes place in the party must be understood in R and Lenin's sense, of confirmation of the doctrine, not of continuous revision, adaptation to presumed unforeseen conditions in which the workers' movement would find itself. When Lenin affirmed in 1899 that we think that an independent elaboration of Marxist theory is especially essential for Russian socialists, he meant a concrete analysis of the concrete situation, not an innovation so much in tactics as in revolutionary theory. The article from which the quote is taken, Our Program, lashes out precisely against the innovators like Bernstein, who was further to the left than the PCI leaders of the second post-war period, while defending himself, as we must continually do as well, from accusations of dogmatism. In the same article, our Vladimir reminds us that Marxist theory has only laid the foundation stone of the science which socialists must develop in all directions. This is the meaning of the independent elaboration of which Lenin speaks, and not that of dismantling Marxism, including cornerstones and foundations. Other Stalinists have evoked an elusive, new Marxist theory of revolution by Lenin. In this, they are in good company with Trotskyists. Mandel, for example, who writes of an alleged original development of the Marxist theory by Lenin, or others of the far left, for whom no parts of Marxism can be dogmatically fixed. They require a continual re-elaboration and development, and 100 others of greater or lesser political caliber, all however eager to find substantial innovations in what they call Leninism, to legitimize their discoveries, their innovations, their ideological filth. The technique of extrapolating sentences from the context and then using them to affirm the opposite of what the original work defends goes back to Stalin. But many students have gone beyond the master in the technique of falsification and have filled millions of pages of anti-communist and anti-proletarian trash. In reaffirming the foundations of Marxism in Lenin, we are therefore forced to employ not very brief quotations and to place them in the true historical and political context in which the texts of Lenin himself were expressed. Part 17. No New Type Party. But what was the party for our two founding maestros? It is worth reminding the Philistines, who fill their mouth with Marx and Engels at every turn, what the working-class party was for them, and from what fountains Lenin drank deep in his efforts to build the Revolutionary Party. The manifesto reads, "Now and then the workers are victorious, but only for a time. The real fruit of their battles lies, not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of the workers. The organization of proletarians into a class, and consequently into a political party, is continually being upset again by the competition between the workers themselves. But it ever rises up again, stronger, firmer, mightier. The communists are distinguished from the other working-class parties by this only. In the national struggles of the proletarians of their different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. The communists, therefore, are on one hand, practically, the most advanced and resolute section of the working-class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all other proletarian parties: formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat. The theoretical conclusions of the communists are in no way based on ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer. They merely express, in general terms, actual relations springing from an existing class struggle, from a historical movement going on under our very eyes. In its struggle against the collective power of the propertied classes, the working class act as a class except by constituting itself into a political party. In its struggle against the collective power of the propertied classes, the working class cannot act as a class except by constituting itself into a political party, distinct from and opposed to all old parties formed by the propertied classes. This constitution of the working class into a political party is indispensable in order to ensure the triumph of the social revolution and of its ultimate end, the abolition of classes. We agree that the proletariat cannot conquer political power, the only way to achieve the new society, without a violent revolution. In order for the proletariat to be strong enough to win on the decisive day, it is necessary, and this Marx and I have supported since 1847, that a specific party be formed, separate from all the others and opposed to them, a class party conscious of itself. Like all other parties, the proletariat learns first of all from the consequences of its mistakes, and nobody can spare them these mistakes altogether. Our views as to the points of difference between a future, non-capitalistic society and that of today are strict conclusions from existing historical facts and developments, and of no value, theoretical or practical, unless presented in connection with these facts and developments. Every reverse suffered was a necessary consequence of mistaken theoretical views in the original program. These few and meager extracts from the immense theoretical corpus that we inherited from our teachers are nevertheless sufficient to establish firm points to understand the nature and role of the proletarian party, and to knock down in advance the criticisms that were directed at the time against Lenin, and subsequently also against us. 1. The need for the party to be able to win in the final struggle against the opposing classes, a struggle that will necessarily and inevitably be violent. 2. The class is such only if organized in the party, otherwise it exists only for statistics but not for itself. 3. Class consciousness resides only in the party and not in individuals, proletarians or not. And 4. The theory of revolution is scientific and cannot ignore past, present, or future. It is embodied in the program, which can be continuously improved in the light of errors and experiences, but precisely because it is scientific cannot be contradicted by new events. Lenin's greatness did not therefore consist in the elaborating of a new type of party, as the Leninists would have us believe, because everything changes, hence the need for discoveries, new ways, original elaborations. Lenin drew from his profound knowledge of Marxist science the project of a party that was, from an organizational point of view, of course, but in the end also theoretically capable of winning the double confrontation in Russia with Tsarism and with incumbent capitalism. Its formula, born for the birth of a true revolutionary Marxist party suited to the conditions of Russia, is in its main outline equally valid for all the parties that were at the time socialist, then communist. It is in the light of the foregoing that it is necessary to evaluate what Lenin defends in his writings from the birth period of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the main objective of this work. Part 18. Dogmatic Marxism versus Revisionism. Lenin starts off by reminding us of the questions posed in the article Where to Begin. The character and main content of our political agitation, our organizational tasks, and the plan for building, simultaneously and from various sides, a militant all-Russia organization. The discussion certainly focuses on the criticism of economism, but provides the opportunity to shed light on many other central issues of the movement. The first chapter is entitled Dogmatism and Freedom of Criticism. Lenin is quick to clarify the point that is most important to him, that of the so-called Dogmatic Marxism, of which he admits to being a messenger. Internationally threatened by the new wave of critics through the revisionism of Bernstein and others, in this fundamental chapter Lenin denounces revisionism and in general the attempt to erase the scientific basis of socialism. With new arguments, one gets to deny or question all the cornerstones of Marxism, including the theory of class struggle. For him, this was only a new variety of opportunism dressed up as an expression of freedom of criticism. Freedom is a grand word, but under the banner of freedom for industry, the most predatory wars were waged. Under the banner of freedom of labor, the working people were robbed. The modern use of the term freedom of criticism contains the same inherent falsehood. Since then we know how many times this word, which does not belong in the bourgeois sense in the vocabulary of Marxism, has been used to commit the most atrocious crimes. No freedom has arisen from the wars that cost tens of millions of deaths, but rather the enslavement of entire continents to the interests of international capital. Part 19. A Compact Group. Lenin concludes the chapter with a passage that is among the most famous of his literature. We are marching in a compact group along a precipitous and difficult path, firmly holding each other by the hand. We are surrounded on all sides by enemies, and we have to advance almost constantly under their fire. We have combined, by a freely adopted decision, for the purpose of fighting the enemy, and not of retreating into the neighboring marsh, the inhabitants of which, from the very outset, have reproached us with having separated ourselves into an exclusive group and with having chosen the path of struggle instead of the path of conciliation. And now some among us begin to cry out, "Let us go into the marsh." And when we begin to shame them, they retort, "What backward people you are! Are you not ashamed to deny us the liberty to invite you to take the better road? Oh yes, gentlemen, you are free not only to invite us, but to go yourselves wherever you will, even into the marsh. In fact, we think that the marsh is your proper place, and we are prepared to render you every assistance to get there. Only let go of our hands, don't clutch at us, and don't besmirch the grand word freedom, for we too are free to go where we please, free to fight not only against the marsh, but also against those who are turning towards the marsh. Of course, the pamphlet and the controversy mainly concern the representatives of opportunism present in the Russian socialist movement, who assert that, for a durable unity, there must be freedom of criticism against the ossification of thought. Lenin recalls that Engels himself, on several occasions, inveighed against those who wanted to interpret the theory of socialism in the most imaginative and, above all, unscientific ways, and that the defenders of critical freedom in Russia are neither free nor critical of Bernsteinism. Opportunism is one of the greatest dangers for the party. The enemy of theory, when it devotes itself to theory, it does so to bend it to its objectives, often dressed as common sense, which are always those of curbing revolutionary tasks to favor contingent, irrelevant, and often bogus purposes. The opportunists are led to slavishly follow the prejudices spread among the workers, to religiously contemplate their backsides, to use Plekhanov's expression. If the worker is mainly concerned with internal issues in the factory, the opportunist becomes a workerist. The masses are always right. Having explained in what terms we can and must be allied with bourgeois democratic movements, that is, maintaining the freedom to reveal to the working class that its interests and those of the bourgeois are opposed, the text goes on to explain how to fight opportunism. First, they should have made efforts to resume the theoretical work that had barely begun in the period of legal Marxism and that fell anew on the shoulders of the comrades working underground. Without such work, the successful growth of the movement was impossible. Before we can unite, and in order that we may unite, we must first of all draw firm and definite lines of demarcation. Therefore, it's nice to get together, but only if you share the essential cornerstones of Marxism. Ban the fetish of union as an end in itself. A short chapter follows, whose title is sufficient to underline its significance. Engels on the importance of the theoretical struggle. The economists quote, against the dogmatists, a sentence of Marx. Every step of real movement is more important than a dozen programs. But Lenin is quick to throw back at them the attempt to diminish the importance of theory, quoting Marx from the same document. To repeat these words in a period of theoretical disorder is like wishing mourners at a funeral many happy returns of the day. Moreover, these words of Marx are taken from his letter on the Gotha program, in which he sharply condemns eclecticism in the formulation of principles. If you must unite, Marx wrote to the party leaders, then enter into agreements to satisfy the practical aims of the movement, but do not allow any bargaining over principles. Do not make theoretical concessions. Lenin quotes a long passage from Engels about the importance of theory and adds, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. The role of vanguard fighter can be fulfilled only by a party that is guided by the most advanced theory. And what is this most advanced theory? This was already quite clear for Lenin as far back as in 1899. Only the theory of revolutionary Marxism can be the banner of the class movement of the workers, and Russian social democracy must concern itself with the further development and implementation of this theory and must safeguard it against the distortions and vulgarizations to which fashionable theories are so often subjected. Lenin reminds us of this in very clear words in 1920 in Left-Wing Communism. Bolshevism arose in 1903 on a very firm foundation of Marxist theory. Bolshevism, which had arisen on this granite foundation of theory. We would later write, if there was no proletarian utopianism in Russia, it is because, when the movement developed up to the preconditions for a party, the theory of this party was already done internationally and came from outside. The party was right to import the already available instruments and weapon which is party theory. There is nothing in this of idealism. Marx could not be formed, the discoveries that constitute it could not be reached, before the bourgeois mode of production had spread and the proletarian class had formed within it, in large and developed national societies. But, once formed, it is valid for the zones, the fields, which arrive late, and it is suitable to establish what will be the process that awaits them and that develops in the same way. Russian Revolution. In essence, Lenin starts from the long quotation by Engels to reaffirm the primacy of theory and program in the indissoluble entwining of all the fundamental aspects of the party's struggle: theoretical, political, and practical economic. Lenin is always very explicit in referring to the founders of modern socialism in the years preceding the Congress. In 1899, our program, he writes, "In Marxist theory, made it clear the real task of a revolutionary socialist party. Not to draw up plans for refashioning society, not to preach to the capitalists and their hangers-on about improving the lot of the workers, not to hatch conspiracies, but to organize the class struggle of the proletariat and to lead this struggle, the ultimate aim of which is the conquest of political power by the proletariat and the organization of a socialist society." And to those who accuse him of overlooking the economic struggle, he replies, "All social democrats are agreed that it is necessary to organize the economic struggle of the working class, that it is necessary to carry on agitation among the workers on this basis, i.e., to help the workers in their day-to-day struggle against the employers, to draw their attention to every form and every case of oppression, and in this way to make clear to them the necessity for combination. But to forget the political struggle for the economic would mean to depart from the basic principle of international social democracy. It would mean to forget what the entire history of the labor movement teaches us." The following year, he again feels the need to affirm his Marxist faith. In declaration of the editorial board of Iskra, "Before we can unite, and in order that we may unite, we must first of all draw firm and definite lines of demarcation. Otherwise, our unity will be purely fictitious. It will conceal the prevailing confusion and binder its radical elimination. It is understandable, therefore, that we do not intend to make our publication a mere storehouse of various views. On the contrary, we shall conduct it in the spirit of a strictly defined tendency. This tendency can be expressed by the word Marxism, and there is hardly need to add that we stand for the consistent development of the ideas of Marx and Engels and emphatically reject the equivocating, vague, and opportunist corrections for which Edward Bernstein, P. Struve, and many others have set the fashion." Therefore, in all his literature, Lenin never hesitates to draw liberally on Marx and Engels in support of the positions he defends inside and outside the party, and this not only in the birth stage of the organization, but throughout all his life. Just read The State and Revolution. Since the Samara period, he used to say that he had to consult Marx, the expression is his, quoted by Trotsky in The Young Lenin, when some critical argument was presented. Another testimony is from Krysov, 1958. "In general, the debates did not last long because the issues had been studied previously. But if, nevertheless, a discussion broke out, Lenin did not impose his point of view, tried to weigh all of the pros and cons, and sometimes declared, 'We must postpone the decision to the next meeting to ask for Marx's opinion.' Then as today, the communists were reproached for living in the past, and for not being able to renew themselves, for not paying attention to the new. In some reflections on the letter from 7ts6f, Lenin writes, 'This is old stuff,' you wail. Yes, all parties that have good popular literature have been distributing old stuff for decades. And the only popular literature that is good, the only popular literature that is suitable is that which can serve for decades. And all you have is just one Iskra. After all, it gets monotonous. 31 issues and all Iskra, while with the captivating people every 2 issues of one title, of trash, are immediately followed by 3 issues of another title, of trash. Now, this is energy, this is jolly, this is news. This is not a novelty for us who, today, remain jealously attached to hitting old nails." Part 20. Sectarianism. Nor is it a novelty to dedicate our attacks and our criticism more to our neighbors and alleged kindred spirits than to the declared enemies of the working class, from which the proletariat does not need to be helped to defend itself. In this we find an illustrious precedent in Neue Rheinische Zeitung No. 4, 1850. Our task is unreserved criticism, more towards the supposed friends than the declared enemies, and, affirming our position, we gladly give up cheap democratic popularity. Are we the only ones to perceive in Marx a badly disguised contempt for democracy? On this our verbally transmitted tradition states, "The closest to us are the worst." This attitude of ours, which has also been demonstrated to be that of the great Lenin, has often earned us the title, considered offensive, of sectarians. Well, it is a title that we do not reject, if this signifies the opposite of the situationist, the opportunist, the one who seeks new ways, not so much for the sake of the revolution, as for exalting his own ego, to be able to say that he made a personal contribution, if not to perpetuate the most miserable of betrayals. We treated the subject in 1959 thus. Well known is the flavor that every lousy petty bourgeois spirit gives to the objections and criticisms of our research to return to the original construction of Marxism. We would take, according to those kobolds, Marx's writing as a revelation which we must blindly believe in, that we would follow as a dogma that it is not permissible to discuss but to accept a priori. We would renounce the precious light of free individual criticism of our intellect and of those who follow us. We would deny that the unfolding of historical facts for over a century has been able to disprove or at least modify those positions deduced using only the data of human history prior to that period around 1850. Well, fools born of degenerate bourgeois culture, this is precisely what we claim and propose, and we have the right to do so because our discovery, the first use of the formidable key that solved the antithesis and enigmas that weighed on humanity, already contained the scientific and critical conquest according to which your claims are empty and inconsistent lies. The economic and social structure of Russia today. El Programa Comunista, 1959. Then again, why not accuse Lenin himself of sectarianism, as the economists actually did in 1902? If with all his alleged maneuvering, always invoked by the lowlife who aspires to place the miserable himself on some page of history, he never hesitated to cut, to condemn, even to mock all those who pretended to adulterate the fundamental tenets of Marxism. An anecdote of Tatiana Lyudovinskaya relates, in Paris, Lenin directed all of our activity. Lenin's harshness and intransigence against opportunists troubled some comrades. One of them said to Lenin, "Why should we expel everyone from the section? With whom will we work?" Lenin replied with a smile, "It matters little if we are not very numerous today, because, on the other hand, we will be united in action, and the conscious workers will support us, since we are on the right path." Part 21. Where does consciousness come from? The next chapter, the spontaneity of the masses and the consciousness of the social democrats, does not abandon the theme of the importance of theory. Where does consciousness reside? Can the workers acquire it by virtue of their experiences in struggle? History has shown us that this is not so. Socialist revolutionary consciousness can reach proletarians only from the outside the economic struggles, and Lenin strongly reaffirms this as already confirmed by our great teachers. The ideas of the ruling class are the dominant ideas in every age. That is, the class which is the dominant material power of society is at the same time its dominant spiritual power. The class that disposes of the means of material production thus has at the same time the means of intellectual production, so that as a whole the ideas of those who lack the means of intellectual production are subject to it. Hence, for the production of the communist conscious, revolution is not necessary only because the ruling class cannot be brought down in any other way, but also because the class that overthrows it can only succeed in a revolution to rise of all the old filth and to become capable of founding society on new foundations. The doctrine of socialism derives from the acquisitions of science, history, economics, philosophy, which are the prerogative of the property-owning classes, which produce intellectuals. The proletarians can arrive at a trade unionist consciousness, that is, understand that they must organize themselves into unions, they must conduct struggles in a certain way, that they can and must make requests to the government for better legislation, and perhaps organize themselves in this sense, but they do not have the tools to proceed further. Lenin does not underestimate the importance of spontaneity, on the contrary. He writes, "There is spontaneity and spontaneity," compared with the struggles of earlier years, also of the Luddite type. The strikes of the 90s might even be described as conscious, to such an extent do they mark the progress which the working class movement made in that period. This shows that the spontaneous element, in essence, represents nothing more nor less than consciousness in an embryonic form. But to expect more from spontaneous struggles is a submission to spontaneity, which has the sole consequence of reinforcing bourgeois influence on the class, and this is the consequence of spontaneists, Not only the economists of the Russian polemic of the time, but also the anarchists and generally those who disdain theory in favor of the worship of blue overalls. There is no middle ground. Since there can be no talk of an independent ideology formulated by the working masses themselves in the process of their movement, the only choice is either bourgeois or socialist ideology. Therefore, all worship of the spontaneity of the working class movement, all belittling of the role of the conscious element, of the role of social democracy means, quite independently of whether he who belittles that role desires it or not, a strengthening of the influence of bourgeois ideology upon the workers. Part 22. Workers in the Party. In a note, Lenin clarifies, to disprove easy and dishonest criticisms of this blunt thesis, that workers are not excluded from the study and sculpting of party doctrine, or indeed from positions of responsibility in the party itself. And there are many examples of this. But these are workers who operate as communists in the party, not as workers, as men who have risen to revolutionary Marxist consciousness and have erased from their minds the place in which the regime of bourgeois exploitation had them locked up. This regardless of the acquired cultural level, whether or not they become intellectuals. The party does not require academic qualifications, which on the contrary push it to the greater caution in accepting membership. The party asks for the determination to work for the revolution with the tools one has. The worker who enters the party ceases to be a worker, he becomes a militant communist, thus wrenching from his heart and his mind the classification under which he has been inscribed in the registry of this putrefying society. Considerations on the organic activity of the party when the general situation is generally unfavorable. Number 11, 1965. The school of the proletarians will be the victorious revolution, which for now asks them for their armed hands, but cannot ask them for a political degree. Even those who are enrolled in the party are not asked to undergo a cultural exam. Since the struggles of the Second International, the left has mocked the thesis of the cultured party, the theory of the primary function of the political party, only guardian and salvation of the historical energy of the proletariat. Il Programma Comunista, number 21 through 22, 1958. Part 23. Mystique of adhesion to communism. We have already seen that characteristics are required for joining the party other than Marxist culture and individual knowledge of our doctrine. Skills are required that Lenin called those of courage, self-denial, heroism, spirit of sacrifice. It is in order to verify these qualities that discrimination is made between the sympathizer or candidate and the militant, the active soldier of the Revolutionary Army. Certainly not because the sympathizer does not know yet, while the militant has consciousness. If this were not the case, the whole Marxist conception would fall, because the Communist Party is that body which must, in the moments of revolutionary recovery, organize millions of men who will have neither the time nor the need to take even fast-track courses in Marxism, and they will adhere to the party not because they know, but because they feel, instinctively and spontaneously, and without the slightest course of study that can mimic school qualifications. And also because they are capable of dreaming, like the cold organizer, the rational Lenin hopes in the same what is to be done. So, joining responds first of all to a push that goes beyond rationality, total understanding, cold reasoning, a choice that we, distant pupils of Lenin, have not hesitated to call also mystical. The problem of knowledge that tormented the many currents of thought over the centuries is solved for us. As future universal science today has access to a party, which alone gives it name to the class that anticipates tomorrow. Just as the party is still halfway between the fiction of the state of the individual and the marvelous human conquest of universality, so in history the ideological cement that distinguishes it lies beyond that ancient errors that poured out the amount of truth for which they arose and had to fall. It leads with a system of principles that can still be called a mystique, the last of the mystiques, whereby many will struggle and fall not only in the supreme sacrifice of life, but also in the greater sacrifice of the joy of checking everything before believing, a joy that will only be achieved after victory. The surviving generation will be given this gift by the last one that had the war-winning mission, in the war of men against men. The economic and social structure of Russia today. Il Programma Comunista, 1959. An anecdote from 1905 is interesting. When Lenin, Faced with the question of whether a priest, a non-Marxist, can be admitted to the Social Democratic Party, responded in the affirmative, placing the acceptance of the party's political program as a condition for joining the party, even when this is not accompanied by adherence to the general conception of history underlying the program. A political organization cannot put its members through an examination to see if there is no contradiction between their views and the party program. Therefore, belonging to the party is verified in the course of party activity, not in an impossible examination of the level of consciousness. We must draw the attention of party members to a general question, that of the situation existing in the POSDR. Like any revolutionary party, ours can exist and develop on the sole condition that there is the primary desire of revolutionaries to help each other in the fulfillment of common work. The Situation in the Party, December 23, 1910. Part 24. Against Bourgeois Ideology and the Law of Minimum Effort. Returning to the theme of the dominant culture, interesting in this regard is a further passage of what is to be done. But why, the reader will ask, does the spontaneous movement, the movement along the line of least resistance, lead to the domination of bourgeois ideology? For the simple reason that bourgeois ideology is far older in origin than socialist ideology, that it is more fully developed, and that it has at its disposal immeasurably more means of dissemination. At this point, we cannot avoid recalling an unwritten rule which is being passed down within the party of the left since its beginnings. The correct path to have the correct results in our theoretical work is not the path of minimum effort, but rather the longest one, the one which requires the most work. We do not adopt the bourgeois method of maximum profit with minimum investment. We are not in a hurry. We are not looking for the results at all costs. A fundamental feature of the phenomenon that Lenin named, branding it with a red-hot iron, with a term that is also in Marx and Engels, opportunism, is a preference for a shorter, more comfortable, and less arduous path, rather than the longer, uncomfortable one fraught with difficulties, on which alone the matching of the assertion of our principles and programs, i.e. of our supreme purpose, with the development of the immediate and direct practical action in the real current situation may take place. Supplementary thesis on the historical task, the action and the structure of the World Communist Party, number 5, Il Programma Comunista, number 7, 1966. Now it is worthwhile to quote a curious sentence from a 1902 written for internal circulation. If the Lord God has chosen to punish us for our sins by obliging us to come out with a mongrel draft, we should at least do everything in our power to reduce the unhappy consequences. Therefore, those who above all are guided by a desire to get through with it as quickly as possible are quite wrong. It may be taken for granted that now, given such constellation, nothing but evil will come of haste, and our editorial draft will be unsatisfactory. It is not absolutely necessary to publish it in number 4 of Zariah. We can publish it in number 5. If we do this, a delay of a month or two will do no harm at all to the party. Part 25. Do-nothings. It is part of our tradition that the young comrade who approaches the party is initially educated with a few blunt mottos. One of these is do-nothings, i.e., people who keep their asses firmly rooted to their chairs rather than going out on the street, which imputes a certain habit, attitude, and state of mind to the communist militant, especially in an area that does not foresee, in the short term, major upturns in the revolutionary class movement. The party's activity for many decades has in fact been mainly devoted to the study and defense of its theory and tactical norms. The recommendation was particularly necessary in the post-1968 period, when any generic youth rebellion was channeled by organizations that treacherously referred to Marxism into the dead ends of activism with no future. That desire not to miss the train of history also affected our party, in which many began to wonder if they had made strategic mistakes that would have excluded them from a feast of a revolution that they saw slipping from their grasp. Suddenly, they wanted new tactical directions to pass into the party, aimed at winning over those young petty bourgeois souls that the old positions of the left rejected. It wasn't difficult to predict how it would turn out. To the disciplined call of us do-nothings to return to the traditional communist attitude that we all shared, the hasty responded with isolation, calumny, vulgar and dishonest lies, and finally with expulsion.